Again, welcome everyone to today's Transcend Professional Development Core Didactic Training titled Working with Data Management and Statistical Colleagues. We are very fortunate today to have Dr. Leslie Laam leading today's presentation. Dr. Leslie Laam is a biostatistician and health services researcher with over 2 decades of experience at the intersection of data science, healthcare operations, and clinical research. She holds a BS in mathematics from Creighton University and MS in evaluative clinical sciences from Dartmouth College and a PhD in health services, research, and policy from the University of Rochester, as well as a fellowship in quality, education, measurement, and research from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. Dr. Laam has contributed to NIH-funded research, published widely in peer-reviewed journals, and presented at national and international conferences. She currently serves as Director of Biomedical Statistics at Sanford Research's Center for Biobehavioral Research and leads the Biomedical Statistics Core for a COBRE Center focused on eating behavior. Her work emphasizes methodological rigor and collaborative approaches, particularly in study design and analysis of intensive longitudinal data, with applications in eating disorders and bariatric surgery outcomes. Today, she'll be discussing how scientists can work effectively with data and statistical teams to advance research goals. Please welcome Dr. Leslie Laam.
Thank you so much, Kent. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for joining today. So as you can tell from the title slide, the title of this talk is Working with Data and Statistical Colleagues. And I realize that might not sound like the most thrilling topic in the world, but I do promise this talk really is about how collaboration makes research smoother, stronger, and I think a lot more enjoyable. So today the goal is to share some lessons learned from my work as a biostatistician and a data collaborator, lessons that I hope will resonate no matter your field or the kind of research that you do. When I first started to think about this talk, the beginning of the year, I think when Kent reached out, I had a different topic in mind, but the last few months of working with the teams really shaped what we're going to be talking about today. So here's where we're headed. We'll start with a quick introduction to CBR, the Center for Biobehavioral Research. So you really know the kind of work we do and the team I work with. I think this might help provide some context to some of the examples I'm giving. Then I'll walk you through a simple flow diagram that shows how data and statistical thinking fit into the life of a research project. After that, I'd like to share 4 stories, 4 examples from my work, each one highlighting a different kind of collaboration, challenge, or success. And then finally, I'll end with a few takeaways, some practical lessons that I hope will help your own collaborations run more smoothly. So let me set the stage by talking briefly about CBR. Our center focuses on eating disorders, disordered eating, obesity interventions, which is primarily bariatric surgery outcomes, although more recently we have started to take a look into studying anti-obesity medications. We've got a pretty diverse group. Some of our scientists focus on the biological aspects, things like microbiomes, biospecimens, nutritional intake, and others focus on the behavioral aspects, right? So mood, sleep, cognitive function, substance use, and many, if not all of our studies are what we call this biobehavioral study, where we're trying to understand how biology and behavior really interact to influence eating patterns, eating behaviors. It's a very mechanistic approach. There is also a wonderful and fascinating arm of research on childhood trauma, but that is not the story for today. I'll be focusing on the more of the eating disorders and biobehavioral components. So our team includes several scientists. A lot of these scientists are practicing clinical psychologists. We at CBR are supported by an incredible data team that touches every project we do. Um, we have a set of project managers and coordinators, clinical assessors, and a great grants team that all supports this work. And now I realize that not everyone in this audience works in a research center like CBR, but my hope is that these stories that I share will be generalizable, that they'll offer you some ideas that you can adapt to your own settings, whatever those settings might be. So, if I had to summarize the main message of this talk in a single line, it would be that early engagement. Early engagement. I wish I could highlight that and make it flash, but I'm not that good at making slides. But early engagement with your data and statistical colleagues creates a smoother and stronger research project. We on the stats and data team, we see ourselves as strategic partners to you scientists, and we are not just the people who crunch the numbers at the end, but we are collaborators who can help scientists reach their goals more efficiently and hopefully with fewer headaches. And so here's a research flow diagram, keeping in mind this is written and designed from the perspective of data and stats. Although I do think that most people on the study team could look at this and say, okay, this is a good start. Maybe you would include more steps or rearrange them, but in general, this is the research flow. It starts with a study idea, your study idea, right? And you spend some time here in the grant proposal development phase, where sometimes, hopefully most of the time, you connect with colleagues, and in those conversations, you might have changes to your study. And you stay in this cycle until you are ready to submit your grant. Once the grant is awarded, we move on. If it's not, then you go back and you stay in this space of continuing to talk to people about how to develop your proposal. The grant is awarded, study prep begins, followed by data collection, continuous data entry and monitoring. Progress updates are provided by all sorts of people on the research team. At some point, data collection is complete. The master databases are created. Your data analysis begins. You are published. Data is cataloged for future use, and you move on to your next idea. It's always this smooth, right? And so I do think when most people think about data and stats, they're probably thinking about these two boxes at the end, data analysis and publication. But in reality, what happens at the beginning of this process, even before the grant is awarded, sets the stage for everything that follows. So in this develop grant proposal process, this space right here is really where statisticians like to be brought in. And so the examples I'll walk through today come from this early phase and a phase of immediately after grant proposal, the notice of award is provided. These early conversations, they often determine how smoothly things go later on. And in those moments, it's in those moments, those conversations, that research strategy and budget can be refined, sometimes significantly after meeting with the stats team. And so this is really where the space where you want to pull in your statisticians. And even if there are no major changes that are needed, statisticians often need time to think through an idea, to explore potential methods, or to reach out to other experts. And that is the first story I will share with you. This story is called Early Conversations. Just a couple of weeks ago, a grant was submitted, an R01 was submitted by a couple of scientists at CBR. Several months ago, they came to me with an idea for this R01, and this is their first aim. To characterize the lived experience of binge eating in a national sample of older adults. Specifically, we will clarify the prevalence, chronicity, and impact of binge eating in older adults. This first aim, this is simple, right? At least it seemed simple. It's about estimating prevalence. There's nothing fancy or difficult about those statistics. It's just prevalence. It turns out that's not exactly the case, simply because our statistics team had never estimated power and sample size for a prevalence study before. It's just not the nature of what we have done at CBR often. And so it does require a bit of, I would say, maybe not so much of a niche method, but you have to know what you're doing. You need experience. And because the PIs came to me early, the stats team, we had time to learn. And the first thing that I asked them was to, hey, walk us through some of this literature. What is known about binge eating in older adults? If there are any prevalence rates or estimates out there in binge eating, what are they? Share that with us. And ultimately, what we found was pretty messy. Um, there was not a single formal prevalence study that we could find. Certainly not one in the close to the right age range. The literature did have some estimates, but that the age ranges varied pretty widely. And it turns out from my assessment of some of these studies, the best data came from European and South American samples, not directly, applicable to the US population when we're talking about binge eating. And so in the end, the range we were looking at from the literature from 3% to 35%. That's quite a spread. And it meant, especially if we were dealing with the single digits near that 3% estimate, it meant that we might be dealing with a relatively rare event. When prevalence drops below about 10%, there's a whole different set of statistical constraints that come into play. And so the stats team went back to the drawing board. We read up on some new methods. We reached out to colleagues for advice. And all of that was possible because these investigators came to us early, before the grant was written, before the deadlines loomed, right? We had time to really think. And so, because of this, we had time to build something that I think was genuinely useful. It was certainly useful for statisticians to engage in further conversation with our PIs. We developed an interactive calculator that linked to sensitivity graphs. So we could explore the different prevalence assumptions that we were pulling from the literature. We could plug in a number, see how power and sample size changed, and then decide which prevalence estimates were the most defensible based on what the PIs have identified in the literature. And that's what's key, is that the PIs were the ones writing the grants, right? They needed to justify their assumptions clearly in their proposal, and this tool that we developed helped them to do that. And this is just a screenshot of the calculator. It is not flashy, but it did make the science better, and I believe it made the grant stronger. And so the first story does have a happy ending. It'll be even happier when that grant is funded. These investigators came to us early. The stats team learned some new things. We were able to reach out to others in the field to talk about this. We figured out an optimal design, and numbers lined up really nicely. Everything was finished on time. Everyone walked away smiling. Rainbows and sunshine, because that's how research works. Um, It doesn't always work that way. And the next story is a little bit messier. Again, a recent story, just in the past month or so, of a grant that did go in. And so I call this story the comparison dilemma. Uh, this This example comes from one of our collaborations in studying outcomes of bariatric surgery. Now, these scientists are leaders in the field, and they come from different institutions across the country, and they get to work with our leaders in bariatric surgery outcomes. And on the screen here is a simple conceptual model, right, of obesity intervention, in this case, surgery, to substance use over time. And this is a relationship that is well studied by CBR and colleagues. So recently, this group of experts, they came together to brainstorm a new grant idea. They wanted to look at obesity interventions through more of a public health lens, not just biology and clinical outcomes, but also neighborhood level variables. These are factors like access to parks, proximity to liquor stores, zip code level type variables. And in addition, they wanted to compare two interventions, not just surgery, but they wanted to include GLP-1 medications. And so at first glance, this all sounded reasonable. Add another intervention, add a few new variables. We've studied this before. How complicated could this be? But once I joined the conversation, a few really big red flags appeared. And I wanted to pull in some other statistical colleagues to have this conversation with. The biggest issue here is that participants aren't randomly assigned to surgery or medication. Uh, so now statistics, to be clear, can deal with non-randomization, right? But certain rules apply. And the self-selection involved in this particular case didn't allow for stats to handle that non-randomization. So participants in this study design, they self-select, and that self-selection is anything but random. As it stands today in the United States, surgery patients at this point in time tend to have higher BMIs and they tend to utilize public insurance. GLP-1 users, anti-obesity medication users, are much more likely to have private insurance or pay out of pocket, as well as have relatively lower BMIs compared to surgery. And this is something that may be changing, but at the time of this grant, this is the case. And those differences, they don't just confound the analysis. They actually define the groups themselves. And that's a problem. But now if we add neighborhood factors, some of these neighborhood factors are also tied to BMI, to insurance, and to access to care. Suddenly we have confounding squared. Then we have the self-selection and the moderating variables that are likely both connected to the outcome of substance use. And so this isn't a stats lecture, so I'll reel myself in. But I just want you to know, I need you to walk away with this is a really big problem. And the question is, what do you do when a scientist or a team of scientists have already started drafting a grant and realize that their design cannot answer the main question cleanly? And this is where the conversation, it gets challenging. It got difficult. These are senior investigators. They've got a draft in progress. They've got a tight timeline. They don't want to start over. We don't, as a stats team, did not want to let them move forward with a design that could not support their conclusions. And so the stats team gets together. We walk through some options, and those include, we can do nothing. We can analyze these two groups separately. This is a statistically valid approach, but it's not a true head-to-head comparison. So you're going to have to adjust the question and the study design and how you set this up in your research strategy. We can match participants on key variables like BMI and SES to make the groups comparable. We can restrict eligibility and narrow BMI range, constrain those SES variables in different ways, and do some frequency matching to really balance those distributions. And each choice, as we walked through this, each choice had trade-offs. Matching and restriction, they improve comparability, but they shrink sample and limit generalizability. Analyzing separately protects the validity, but it loses the excitement of a direct comparison. And so this was really, I think, the aha moment for the team, for the scientists as well as the stats group, is that study design determines the story you can tell. It's not just your analysis. The study design actually determines the story you can tell. The analysis is there to support the story that can be told. And so I think this experience reinforced a powerful lesson, right? Is that bringing statisticians in early, it's not just about power analysis or sample size tables. We are capable of doing a lot more than that. This is really about strategy. Share your strategy with your statisticians, and we can help think through things together. We can help identify challenges before they become deal breakers. We can help you design studies that are going to stand up to review. And we are not the content experts, right? That's the scientists. But we are the methodology experts, so we can help guide and answer some questions. And when we combine the content expertise with the methodological expertise early in the process, I think it can be the difference between a fundable and a rigorous grant and one that falls apart under a little bit of scrutiny. So story number 3, I'll call this Words Matter. This is about something I think that seems small, maybe can seem small to some folks. And it's really about how scientists, how you phrase your hypotheses. Words that you use in your hypotheses can have major consequences on your analysis, your power calculations, and even potentially your budget if sample size is determined by your power calculations. So at CBR, many of our studies use what's called intensive longitudinal data. This is another word for this is hierarchical or nested data, but intensive longitudinal data has a bit more nuance. It's more intensive. It's super nested. And we collect repeated measures. Sometimes there will be 100 or hundreds of observations per person across weeks, across days, within days. And so on the screen here, you can see a very simple conceptual model showing negative affect leading to binge eating, right? This is a widely used conceptual model. Negative affect, this is a composite of several emotions. People feel shame or upset, distressed, and it's all captured. This composite measure of negative affect is captured multiple times a day. In this example database here, a single participant has 5 rows of data, and at each time point within a day, negative affect is collected and binge eating is collected. So when we talk about this relationship conceptually, negative affect predicts binge eating. It's very simple enough. But to a statistician, especially a statistician on our team, the question immediately becomes, okay, wait a minute, what level are we talking about? We are thinking, when we see this conceptual model, we are thinking of the database. How is this structured? At what level are you talking about negative affect across participants, across days, from moment to moment within a single day? And this is why words matter, because you can have a really great, simple conceptual model that captures what you're talking about, but the words in your hypothesis is going to signal to the statistician how they're going to need to structure the analysis and how power should be estimated. And I'd like to give you a few examples of hypotheses that can be written just from this basic relationship. If we take a look at these two hypotheses, they look almost identical. Higher negative affect predicts increased likelihood of a binge in the next time point. Negative affect predicts subsequent binge eating episodes. They are very similar. Both ask about what happens in the next binge eating episode. But one of them has a primary outcome. Did the binge occur? And the other is a count or a rate. And this small difference means the power analysis changes completely. The first is going to use a logistic mixed model, and the second could use a negative binomial model, or it could potentially even use a survival analysis model. Those are going to come up with very different power analyses, which is going to have an impact on your sample size. This next set of hypotheses, again, they all look similar, right? But they could be modeled in many different ways. So we see, negative affect is associated with binge eating episodes. Negative affect predicts greater severity. Individuals with higher negative affect are more likely to binge. Within-person increases in negative affect predict negative affect predict binge episodes. And so when we look at these next four, some of these outcomes are continuous, there's binary, there are counts. The last one explicitly uses this intentional longitudinal design, which is just a completely different analytic and power framework. And so the point is, from one conceptual diagram, you can write several valid hypotheses. And each hypothesis carries different implications for your study design, sample size, or your budget. And the stats team, we can help translate your scientific ideas into analytic language. We can help make sure the methods used align with your goals before anything is locked into the grant proposal. And I think this is where it gets practical, right? So once I have a clear sense of what a scientist wants to do, and we've talked through, maybe many times we've talked about their proposal, I always ask for a finalized, and I mean a finalized aim page before I start writing the statistical section of a grant. The reason is because a small word change can completely change the model. And I have learned this the hard way through rounds of rework. I have really learned it the hard way. I'm a slow learner too. Usually, this rework occurs close to the grant deadline. It increases stress. So my deal with investigators today is that I need a finalized hypothesis. Please, please don't make small changes, small edits, unless you've talked to your stats team first, because they might not be small at all. And I promise you that you can keep your statistician really excited to see you by giving them your final aims page before you ask them to start writing. All right, this is the last story. This one is my favorite because it highlights our data team. And good data design is truly transformative. There is no amount of sophisticated statistics that can fix a data set that was poorly designed or that was inconsistently captured. If the data are messy, if the data are missing, if it is ill-structured, then even the best statistical models cannot rescue the study. And so this is our data team, Lucy, Annie, and Connor. This team is led by Annie, who spent the last couple of decades refining how we capture data at CBR. And the difference this team makes in our research is extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. How do we capture good data? When I talked to Annie a few weeks ago and I said, hey, Annie, can you provide some examples, something tangible that I can share with this audience that'll highlight what you do and how highlighting good data capture makes a difference? Annie kind of laughed at me and she said, well, hold on. Most of what we build, it just looks like survey forms, right? We create a bubble or we create a box and she's right. At first glance, this does not look that exciting, right? But it's what's behind those forms. It's what's behind what she is building um, that is so powerful. So she did come up with a visual of an older study, and I do think it's a good example, although the content we use now, this is outdated. This actually, this procedure is no longer used, but walk with me with just the visual here. Before the data team's redesign of this sheet, right, these forms were filled with open text fields. Absolutely everything was free form. And that sounds really flexible. And I know scientists like flexibility because they can capture more, they think they can capture more data. They want their participants to be able to provide as much information as possible. But for a data analyst, it's an absolute nightmare. For a statistician, it can be a nightmare, unless you are working in qualitative data, which we are not here. So after this redesign, free text became, so here's the boxes that, Annie's talking about. After the redesign, everything was standardized. So free text became discrete checkboxes or drop downs. Open-ended questions were restructured into fields. Comments were reserved only for exceptions, not for the primary data. And this allows for cleaner data capture, which means faster validation, which means fewer errors, and structure that aligns directly with how statisticians are going to analyze the data, because no amount of stats can fix poor data capture. One of the things I think that our data team has identified is that if you use free text, if you're going to, and scientists need to, people need to do that. But if you're going to use free text, try to pair it with as many structured fields as possible. Um, for example, instead of describe any symptoms, ask people to check off symptoms and then add another box, for anything that's not listed. And it's small shifts like this that can really save time, and it can save headaches for your analysts, your statisticians, and ultimately scientists. Okay, so circling back to this flow diagram, I hope it's clear that data and stats work. It's not limited to, the two boxes down here, the analysis and the publications. I believe our influence, I believe our value can stretch all the way across the research process. We can help shape your research idea and your hypotheses. We can help refine your methods and your design. We can build data structures that are going to actually support your analysis and answer the specific questions that you have. Um, and ultimately, we want to make sure your final models tell a clear and valid story. And so I'll wrap this up with a few takeaway points. And the first is that statisticians, we are strategic partners. We can be strategic partners. Engage us early before you've settled on your aims or your design. We can help you identify confounding factors. We can point out potential sources of bias. We can flag design issues that could become fatal flaws later. And I think, keep in mind what keeps us energized is learning new methods right alongside of you. Don't assume we've done every analysis under the sun, but do assume that we really love to learn new methods if it's not something we've done before. We enjoy supporting your work, and we want to be able to provide that support in the best way possible. So talk to us early. I think the second take home would be that final hypotheses are rarely final. And we understand your ideas evolve. But if you think about revisiting or revising your hypotheses, uh, talk to us first. Talk to your statistician first to just make sure it's not a major change. Uh, Third is that data capture is the foundation of a good analysis, period. The best model cannot save bad data. So rely on your data team to let them help you with the right structure. From the moment you receive your notice of award, that's when the data team should be active and engaged to help you set up the right structure for you. Um, I think, finally, remember that we really are here to support your science. We're not here to slow it down. And engaging early is not about adding complexity. It's really about building confidence that your research plan is going to hold up. That's what I've got today. I appreciate you being here, and I am happy to take questions. I would love to hear about your experiences or talk through any challenges that you have faced in collaborating with your own data or stats teams.
All right, Dr. Lamb, thanks you so much for your talk. I have a question on the statistician side. I work as the biostatistician for Transcend. Um, do you have any thoughts or comments on sort of the level of sort of statistical explanation that you should be giving to your research, like the researchers that are coming to you? Because it's easy to sort of write this a paragraph of like exactly how I would do the analysis that might not comport with how they understand anything about statistics. So, yeah, maybe how much education would you think about doing?
With a scientist that's coming to
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that it really depends on the level of interest the scientist has. So there are scientists that I work with who are very, very strong analytically, likely could write the majority, if not all, of their own methodology section, right? But their interest is not there. And so with somebody who has a lot of strong background, I might include more detail with them. I might sit down and explain,
Mhm.
here's why we're doing what we're doing. There are other scientists who say, look, I do not want to touch my stats. So please, please
Mhm.
take this from me. I trust what
Mhm.
you're trying to say. And I think that to find a balance for folks who are not as interested, who really want to fully rely on me for that analytic expertise, if there are issues or if there are challenges that I'm seeing that, oof, you're writing this hypothesis or your study design doesn't support your hypotheses, then I do think a more nuanced conversation is needed.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's sometimes I'll just ask, straight out, how involved do you want to be in the drafting of
Mhm.
this statistical, methodology or of this analysis? How involved do you actually want to be? And it really does range. There are people who like to
Mhm.
sit and watch me code. There are people who like to say, just give me the output and help me understand what it means.
Mhm.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Honestly, I appreciate that talk. Your big ticket stories and points that you told, I could think of multiple examples of where I could have been, I could have served as the fodder for, to provide the fodder for those stories. I've made lots of mistakes that you focused on. Um, I don't know if I have a question so much as just to reiterate a point, and that was the final hypotheses are not final hypotheses piece that you talked about. Uh, I have been absolutely guilty of that in the past, and I'm sure I will be again in the future, unfortunately. But I remember Ross at one point saying, as we tweaked our hypotheses for maybe a sixth time, he was frustrated and said, it's hard to hit a moving target. Because the hypothesis, it would seem like the teeniest, tiniest little massaging or tweaking to the hypotheses, to the actual verbiage, it isn't going to have any real implications on anything. But in fact, it did. And it caused problems. Just to reiterate your point, I guess, that is even when you make the slightest little change to the wording of your hypotheses, I think it's really important to go back to you for us or to your statistician, whoever that is for folks listening, and make sure that what you're doing isn't screwing something up in the work that he or she has already done. So just reiterating your point.
Thank you, Scott. It really is interesting. Words matter. The one word change in a hypothesis um, can have an impact on truly have an impact on sample size, which is going to go back to budget, which is don't change things without chatting with us. Other words, you can change 5 words and maybe it's not going to have a big difference, but chat with us first.
Dr. Lam, I greatly enjoyed your presentation. I'm curious actually to envision maybe the flip side or the obverse of this talk. That is, it's great if you can actually meet with investigators during the initial stage of a project, but in the real world, or at least in my sort of very messy personal world, that's not always the opportunity that you have. There's a there's a quick deadline. You need to do something. Perhaps the data are already gathered, and really somebody comes to you not to design the best, but maybe to minimize the damage, and ask, well, this is what I did. This is what I got. How can you help me out? I think that puts statisticians in a very delicate position because there are things that you can do with the data that perhaps look legitimate to a non-statistically informed audience, but that you probably know deep down is not a legitimate approach, or it gives an answer that is lateral to the question that's being asked, but doesn't really answer it. So
Yeah.
I would love to hear in a talk like, yes, this is the ideal world. This is what I would love to do. Here's what actually happens, and here are the situations that statisticians face, and here's here are the problems that we have.
Well, that is fantastic, actually, because I think we do. I run into that frequently, right? So in the that flow diagram, we have our data sets are archived for future use, and we have at CBR we have some T32 fellows. We also have scientists that come back and utilize those data sets. Data's already been collected. Let's ask some new questions. Let's figure out, do some new things that we haven't used this data for before. And I often find, and this is the case for both younger investigators and more experienced investigators, that they'll come with a question, they'll have some hypotheses, and I'll look at the data and say, well, I'm not sure we can answer this in this format. And there will be some wiggle room. There are ways to say, okay, well, do you really mean this? So you all are the content experts, not me. I will never pretend to be a content expert in any field except statistical methodology, right? So I will say, we can, if your question is adjacent but close enough, we can adjust the methodology, and your hypothesis might shift a little bit. Is this still what you mean? Does this still capture the scientific intent? So we hold up um, our ethics and our integrity, versus if I say, look, the data just can't answer that question. Can you go back to the drawing board and come up with some other questions? Because I am not going to turn this into a fishing expedition that challenges um, any data can do all sorts of things. We can fish and hunt all day long for things that might be statistically significant, but might not be ethically appropriate or valid unless you have that a priori hypothesis. And so there will be pushback. And there's flexibility. It's not black and white. We can adjust. We can have a conversation, and I can probe and say, can you tell me a little bit more? Is this kind of what you're talking about? And if we're in the ballpark, I can meet I can meet you there. If you're just throwing things at the wall, I'm going to say not, go back and come up with something solid, and then come back to me and we can have this conversation again.
Leslie, I'm going to stick with the same theme, which is how can a scientist and a statistician actually understand each other? And I think you've kind of shown us that there has to be some kind of a relationship. You're talking about come to me early. I want to try and understand your ideas, that kind of thing. And I do think I've just been sitting through budget meetings, and I listen to these budget folks talk about numbers, and at the end I say, I don't really know what you just said, but can I afford a new computer? Because I've got practical decisions to make here. And it kind of reminds me of when I do have unproductive conversations with a statistician sometimes. And I think it's because I haven't done a good job of articulating my language, and maybe sometimes a statistician isn't all that interested in my language or my ideas. But in the end, I think what happens then is the statistician winds up telling me some really cool things about some new technique, which I don't know what it is, and I don't know how it applies to my ideas. And I fear sometimes, are we really working together? And does this person really understand what I want? And do I really understand the output? And I hope this sort of came together well. So my question is, do you have any hints on how to help scientists be good communicators?
The first thing that comes to mind, and I think you might connect with this too, Steve, but the first thing that comes to mind is I really love those simple conceptual models. Now they don't tell me enough, right? But a picture goes a really long way. Boxes and arrows, but a timeline, especially a longitudinal, if that's your design, if that's what you're interested in, I think it's drawing. I think if we can come together and move from all of the content and all of the pros that you have in your mind as a scientist about the information that you're an expert in, and I come together and kind of check the equations and why things work the way they work. If I can leave that aside a little bit and come here and we can start to understand each other through pictures. Let's play a game of Pictionary. I think that goes a long way. I really do. One of the things I always ask for, I want a conceptual model, even though, like I showed you, you can have a dozen hypotheses from the same thing. I want a conceptual model so we can at least get on the same page, and I want to understand how are you measuring your constructs? How often are you measuring them? Talk to me not in such a data kind of way, but talk to me about the practical methods of how you plan to study this, whatever it is you're studying. How are you collecting your data? Or if the data is already collected, from this, help me understand, are there time points that you're most interested in studying? And if we can draw a picture that we can both agree on, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do think just repeat conversations, hallway conversations, coffee conversations. I think that's how you kind of get to know each other's language a little bit. So, thank you.
Agreed.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Laam? Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Lamm, for the insightful presentation, and thank you to all the participants for attending today. Please remember to complete the short survey in the chat regarding today's presentation. We hope to see everyone at the next didactic training on November 10th. And with that, have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Kent.
Yep.